Welcome to the second lecture of the 2018-19 season of Library Live. My name is Nancy Dahlfors, and I'm the chair of the Library Live Committee and a board member of the Newport Beach Public Library Foundation. I'm wondering if I could see a show of hands for those of you here tonight who are members of the foundation. Oh, wow, thank you. Thank you for the support. If you wish to join, we have a membership table right at the back that outlines the benefits of being a Library Foundation member. So you can check that out afterwards. This Library Live program is presented by the Library Foundation. Our programs are funded entirely with private contributions from sponsors and foundation members like you. The foundation would like to thank the following people for their sponsorship of this series: Natasha and Todd Palmer, Sam and Tammy Tang, Dr. Tom Weinberg Staple, and Lauren Blackwood. I'm pleased to announce that our next Library Live speaker is Rachel Devlin, who will be speaking about her latest book, A Girl Stands at the Door, on February 28, 2019. Her book sheds light on the remarkable young girls who led the school desegregation movement before Brown versus Board of Education. And now I'm excited to introduce Bill Bracken, founder of Bracken's Kitchen, who will be introducing tonight's speaker, Jonathan Bloom. Bill is a nationally renowned chef with over 35 years' experience. He was an executive chef at the Four Seasons Hotel in Newport Beach when he left to open Bracken's Kitchen in order to impact the lives of impoverished families. Bracken's Kitchen's mission is to provide nutritious meals to families and children in Orange County who struggle to feed themselves through food and recovery and repurposing, as well as culinary training. At the end of the program, you'll be tasting Bracken's Kitchen's delicious gourmet and repurposed food out in this courtyard. Thank you, Bill, for joining us.
Is this a teleprompter for me? I've never had one of those. Thanks, Nancy, for introducing me. Before I introduce Jonathan, I want to say a couple words. And we're talking about food waste, and there's a lot of talk about food waste. And it's important to me to remind everyone of a simple fact. Food doesn't actually become waste until we throw it away. And recently the USDA reported 40% of our food supply in America is ending up in our landfills, having never been consumed by humans. 40%. Jonathan, I'm sure, is going to talk a lot more about that. 40% is going in the trash cans. Think about that, because we are throwing it away. You go to Feeding America's website, you'll learn that 1 out of 8 Americans are facing food insecurity every day. That's 12.5% of our population, while we're throwing 40% of our food away. Here in Orange County today, right here in Orange County, 48% of our children didn't have lunch without the government's help through the free and reduced lunch plan. 1 out of 2 kids in Orange County didn't have lunch today without the government's help. It's just amazing. So when I think back to 3 years ago when we started our recovered food program at Bracken's Kitchen, it was a couple boxes of food that we got through the Chefs in Hunger program. And we took this and we turned it into something special and tried to make a meal out of it. And that was 3 years ago. And obviously with all the attention on food waste, that looks vastly different today. On Sunday afternoon, I spent several hours on the phone trying to arrange a truck that showed up on Monday morning. When that truck showed up to the kitchen, we had 8 pallets of food in it. 1,400 pounds of baby mixed greens that you'd pay a fortune to go buy over Bristol Farms right across the street here, down the street, wherever that's at. We had 1,200 pounds of ribeye steaks, almost 2,000 pounds of boneless, skinless chicken breasts that came to us. Endless other small things, but they came to us because of the work of local people like Wasteland OC that's here, Jonathan, and just raising awareness of food waste. And with that thought in mind, awareness is so important. And I'm really excited. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Bloom. Jonathan is a journalist, author, and consultant on food waste. Jonathan wrote the book American Wasteland and created the website Wasted Food. He has spoken on food waste from New York to New Zealand, and he's even driven through Kansas. I'm going off script here. We can talk about that later. And he thought Kansas was pretty cool, by the way. I'm from Kansas, if you haven't figured that out. He's consulted with the United Nations, FAO, Harvard Law School, General Mills, and Minneapolis Public Schools, just to name a few. Jonathan is an advisory board member for Food Tank, Refed, and Imperfect Produce. In 2014, he was an expert in residence at Bucknell University and reprised that role at Concordia College in 2017. A Boston native, Jonathan now lives in Durham, North Carolina with his wife, 2 sons, and many, many containers for all of his leftovers because he doesn't throw them away. and he's a really nice guy. I got the chance to talk to him. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Bloom. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Bill, for that kind introduction. Perhaps too kind, but I do love Kansas. It's a great place to drive through. We'll leave it at that. All right, but yeah, thanks so much to Bill for that kind introduction, to Nancy Dalfors, the Library Foundation, the Library Live Committee, the sponsors, Kathy, Kunga, for all of the hard work that has gone into putting this evening together. And I'm really excited for the totality of this evening, especially to sample Bill's work out in the courtyard there. So please do stick around for that. Now, sorry, bear with me for a second. I just need to finish up my little snack here. Why is everybody looking at me like that? Now, it wasn't all that long ago that doing that was the normal course of action for when we had something in our hands that we didn't want anymore. And littering was the thing to do. There was nothing wrong with that. Now, obviously, that was a bit theatrical, and I promised to pick up my trash at the end. My mother didn't raise a litterer. And that's because we as a culture decided that practice was not something we should condone and not something that we should be doing. And so how did we do that? Well, a few different ways. We passed laws in most municipalities in the country, making that illegal. And then we created a campaign to stamp out that behavior. And so I raised that topic to point out that with wasting food, despite the fact that wasting food has much graver environmental and social consequences, that's the norm today. And so, unfortunately, throwing away food is not unusual, and it's widespread and condoned. Now, I'm an optimist, and part of my message here is to point out that I think we are about to flip that around. And it's kind of the last environmental ill that we can do in such an open manner. So hopefully, with your help, we can turn this problem on its head and reduce the amount of food waste we're creating. And so tonight, I'll talk a whole bunch about wasted food, but my main takeaway is that wasted food is something that we not only should focus on, but that we can actually conquer. And it's something quite doable. So anyhow, here's what's on tap for tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about how much food we're wasting in the country, where and why that food is not being eaten, and get into some of the implications of our food waste, and finish up with the positive message of how we can put a dent in this issue and how we can reduce the amount of food we're wasting. Okay, so you heard the 40% figure there Bill mentioned earlier. That's how much food America is creating and then not using. And so when you look at the global level, it's a little bit of a rosier picture. About a third of the food available for consumption is not consumed. But domestically, it's pretty staggering. It's close to 50%. 40% is a rough ballpark estimate, and that comes at a pretty significant cost when you look at the pounds and the dollar values attached to that. But as I mentioned, that's just a ballpark estimate, and I'm a proponent of trying to give some visuals to help you imagine what that looks like. And so let's use a ballpark to do that. So this is the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, just a few hours north. And every day, America is wasting enough food to fill that very stadium with food waste. So if we were to truck all of the food wasted in the country every day, we'd be able to fill that stadium to the brim. And just to give you a sense of what that might look like closer to home, it's almost like a disaster movie. Anyway, so you get the picture. We are creating mounds of food that we could be using. We're not doing a great job there. And so let's think about where that's happening. The quick answer to where our food waste comes from is everywhere. And food is lost at all steps of the food chain from farm to fork. Now on that farm level, a lot of food never leaves the farm. A lot of goods aren't even harvested. Perhaps the price of a crop may not justify the expenditure of labor, or in this case, in Salinas, California, with iceberg lettuce, you have pickers not picking a good portion of the field because they know it won't survive that cross-country journey. So despite the fact that you'll have lettuce heads that are perfectly lovely and healthy looking at the time, they have been passed over because they didn't feel quite right. And so that's a situation that's happening quite widespread throughout the produce world. And that's a result of our long-distance food chain. The waste continues on to the supermarket level, where often foods are thrown away because of a date stamped on the package. And that's what's happened with these bag salads here. This is a picture from the supermarket where I worked as part of the research for American Wasteland. And a quick little story. My first day of work, before I even got a name tag, the produce manager pointed me to the wall of refrigerated produce and told me to start pulling anything that had a sell-by date of that day on it. And I didn't really know what was going to happen with that produce. About an hour later, he told me to throw it away. And we didn't have that safety net. We didn't have the Bracken's Kitchen or any kind of nonprofit to donate the food that's edible but not sellable. But the larger point is that supermarket dumpsters are filled with edible food, unfortunately. The food waste certainly continues at the restaurant or cafeteria level, depending on what model they have. College cafeterias with their all-you-can-eat setup are particularly laden with food not being used. And then finally, the waste continues on to the household level. And unfortunately, we often fill our refrigerators to the point that we can't possibly use all of our food before it goes bad. And about a quarter of the food we bring home doesn't end up getting used, in large part due to the clutter that we create. And when things get lost in the refrigerator, they usually get found in a less than savory condition. So this kind of clutter leads to the whole out of sight, out of mind syndrome, and a lot of food going for naught in the fridge. This picture might look familiar to some of you. In case you're wondering how I got a picture of your household refrigerator, let's just say I have my ways. Okay, so why is all this food being wasted? Why are we squandering food from farm to fork? Well, there are several root causes of food waste in this country, and I'll tackle them one by one. The first thing I want to talk about, the first topic, is abundance. And what I mean by abundance is that we're producing twice the amount of calories that we need per person. So roughly 4,000 calories per person per day is available, with the average man or woman needing about 2,000 calories per day. So that's coming in large part due to this farm policy and a mindset of growing from fence row to fence row. Let's create as much food as we can and not really focusing on the impacts of that mindset or policy. And so we have an excess, and a lot of that happens at the agricultural level. This image here is from a gleaning outing in my home state of North Carolina, and those are some of the sweet potatoes that some volunteers and myself recovered just one morning out in the field, and that's just a portion of what we got that day. But the thing is, we could have been out there for a whole week and still not picked all of the sweet potatoes available. And this image really, to me, symbolizes the level of farm abundance in this country. That concept applies elsewhere as well, and we have a lot of food at various steps. I don't know if anyone has had this experience, but have you ever gone into a supermarket and seen empty shelves or sparse-looking shelves? Yeah, that's kind of that's anathema to the supermarket world, and we see this abundance everywhere we go, and it creates this mindset of not having to be careful with our food because there's plenty of it, and that's true. There is plenty of it. But that mindset has an impact. The second factor with abundance comes in situations like this, where you'll go to a restaurant and receive a plate that looks something like that. Now, here's an all too common occurrence where you have a couple of choices. You can either overeat or waste food. Now, there is a third way. You can take the leftovers home. But you might not be going straight home, or you might be one of those strange people who doesn't like leftovers. I've heard they exist. I'm still trying to understand them, but that's another story. But when we're put in this position, we don't have great choices, and unfortunately, this is a root cause of two problems: wasted food and obesity. And it's something that unfortunately is quite common, perhaps not in Newport Beach, perhaps not in some of the more enlightened parts of this community, but certainly at many restaurants where value has been equated with portion size. And I'll be honest with you about this picture here. I have no idea what that's a picture of. I would guess that it involves eggs and cheese, but I'm pretty sure it's about twice the amount of food that most people would want to eat at one time. All right, the next driver of our food waste is this notion that our food has to look beautiful or perfect. And we've reached this point in our culture where food's appearance often trumps its taste. And so you have these displays like you see here, and that probably doesn't stand out to you as anything strange because that's what we've been conditioned to expect in the market. And unfortunately, to get that kind of immaculate, perfect display of produce, there are countless others that are A, not harvested, or B, cast aside at some point from farm to store. And there's this constant winnowing process. I visited with a pear grower not too far from here in Lakeport in doing the research for my book. This is Nick Avisovich. And I was asking him to take me through his orchard after the harvest, to sort of show me what the pickers had left behind and why they had chosen to leave some behind. And it was really unfortunate and a bit sad where he kept pulling down pears and he couldn't really find anything wrong with this one or the next one. And finally, when he did find a few blemished pears, they're ones like you see there. And, just these small problems. But the retail buyers want a certain size, shape, color, and are very unforgiving when it comes to those kind of blemishes. So as a result, you have a picture like this, and that's at the bottom of every tree in the orchard. And that's kind of par for the course in that world. All right, the next topic on the next root cause of wasted food is cost. And quite simply, despite rising food prices, when you look at the percentage of household spending that goes toward food, it's near all-time lows. So as a result, our food is pretty cheap to us, and we treat it that way. I like this slide because not only does it convey that cheapness, but it has a nice bit of cultural insensitivity to boot. So, yeah, get your Passover pork ribs. They're going like hotcakes. But in all seriousness, there's no other country in the world that spends as little of its household budget on food, and that has an impact on how we value it, or in most cases don't value it. And finally, the last driver of our wasted food habit is that we as a culture have essentially lost a good bit of our food knowledge. And what I mean there is that our culture has collectively stepped out of the kitchen. And we don't know how to make food last. We don't know how to store food properly. And we certainly aren't great at knowing how long our food will last or whether it's still good. And so there's this knowledge gap that a few generations have accumulated. And so you see labels like this one on a takeout box from a restaurant that says at the bottom, "When in doubt, throw it out." And unfortunately, that's, I think, the wrong message to be sending, because we're actually quite good at doing that already. But we've gotten away from trusting our senses and knowing when food is good or not, and then also knowing when to put it in the freezer or how to store food to extend that lifespan. And I don't know if you can read the fine print on that box, but it says to use these leftovers within 24 hours. And that might be good advice if you don't have a refrigerator, but seems a bit extreme if you do have one. And unfortunately, that's all too common these days. And another illustration of this lost food knowledge is that we have these expiration dates on just about everything these days. It's not just on bottles of milk, it's on individual eggs, or on my favorite, bottles of water, which is a strange one. I don't know about you, but I can't remember the last time I had spoiled water. But so these date labels are ubiquitous, and they have come to be so prevalent because we have forgotten how to trust our senses, our sense of smell, taste, and sight, to know when food is good or not. And you probably have a sense that there's some caution built into those date labels, and that's good, because those labels do speak to the food's quality. It's not about the safety of that item. And if you're treating that date label as the gospel truth on when that food is going to expire, then you're probably throwing away lots of good food. But you might not know that the only thing required to have a date label on it by federal law is infant formula. And so these are all voluntarily put on by food companies to fill that void of knowledge and to speak up for where our senses used to play that role. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about where we're wasting food and why, but what's the big deal? I mean, we've got a lot of food. I already mentioned that. We've got about twice the amount of food we need. What's the big deal if we throw out nearly half of it? So when I was first researching this topic, the topic really came to light for me thanks to a volunteer opportunity at a place called DC Central Kitchen. And they do similar work to Bracken's Kitchen in that they're recovering excess food from supermarkets and caterers and restaurants, and they're actually training homeless people to cook with that excess food and then helping to feed hungry folks with those creations. But being there that day, for me, just seeing the sheer quantity of excess food, but also the quality, really opened my eyes to all kinds of food being wasted and what a problem this was in America. But bringing it back into the question of why we should care, I was really charged up after seeing all of that wasted food, and I wanted to write about it. And I had this real visceral response to seeing all that excess food and to knowing that in many cities and towns that would have been thrown out. And so I approached this editor and told him I wanted to write an article about all the wasted food in America. And he said, "Why should I care?" And it was a real interesting moment for me. It was a real setback because to me, I just had this visceral response to seeing food being wasted. And that was part of how I was raised. But I realized that the answer, because, is not a good answer. So we should care about food waste just because is really not that persuasive. And so that was instructive for me and helped me realize that I had to actually form a thesis in an argument. And so from that point on, I realized that we should care about wasted food because it has harmful ethical, economic, and environmental consequences. And so that's what I would hope that you'll take from this discussion tonight when we think about the implications of our 40% wastage. So I'll go through those one by one, and I'll start with the ethical component because I think it's most important. And Bill did a nice job highlighting some of the need in this area and the country. And when I think about wasted food and hunger, there's a certain saying that comes to mind, that something that I heard at the dinner table, maybe you did as well, or maybe something you've said to your kids or grandkids. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Feel free to just call it out. Yes. Yes. Clean your plate because there's starving people somewhere. Oh, I've never heard that one. That's great. Iwo Jima. Yeah, the place where people are hungry tends to vary depending on generation. But the point is the same. We should eat what we have because they're hungry people somewhere else. Eat what's on your plate. And so that's an interesting expression. It's a little problematic because the food on your plate is never going to help anyone else. By the time it gets on your plate, it's kind of like not going to help anyone who's hungry. So it's logistically inaccurate. It's also a little unhealthy because it invites guilt to the dinner table. It basically tries to guilt us into eating what we have. But there's a reason that expression has been around for generations. And I believe there's a kernel of truth in there. And that is to have this juxtaposition of hunger and waste is morally callous. And to know that people just down the street aren't getting enough to eat while you're wasting food is problematic and is what I would call a paradox that needs to change. And so that hunger and waste coexistence is really the root cause of why I keep talking about this issue and why I hopefully will shed some light on the topic to you and maybe get you thinking about that a little bit. And just to have that 40% wastage figure in America while roughly 15% of American households are food insecure, that to me leaves a lot of room for improvement, especially given that we're a nation with plenty of resources, both financial and food resources. And a lot of people think about hunger, and they think it's something that happened in the past. They get an image of the Great Depression and perhaps a bread line during that time. Although in this case, a coffee and donuts line, which seems pretty cool. But the larger point is that hunger is unfortunately alive and well. And although we call it food insecurity today, it's a problem that many people face. And there's caloric hunger, there's people just not getting enough food, and then there's a nutrient hunger, people not getting the right kinds of food. And so there's two different problems that need to be addressed there. And the last slide on this topic, it's what I would call the disgrace of plenty, to have that abundance, to have so many calories available, and then to not figure out the logistics behind using one problem to help solve another. And if we were to find the will to make that happen, I think we would be able to do a whole lot of good. And just redistributing 2% of all the food that we currently throw away would be enough to lift all of the food insecure Americans above that line into food security and make this country a better place. Okay, shifting gears a tiny bit. I'm not an economist, and so I won't spend tons of time on this topic, but put simply, America's wasted food habit is a bad use of resources. In this case, fiscal resources. We'll get into the natural resources in a second. But as you see there, there's a tremendous amount of money embedded in the food that we've created. So despite the fact that it's not terribly dear or expensive to us, it still, when taken as a whole, represents a lot. So there's the global estimate there, and then the domestic as well. And pay particular attention to the household loss figures. About $2,000 for the average family of four is thrown away through the food that they don't use. So it adds up. And I find when people start composting, they start to see the amount of food they're not using, and that's quite helpful. And as we all know, money is a pretty good motivator. So if you could start to put a price tag on the food you're not using, that might help change our behavior. Okay, so I mentioned natural resources, and I'll get into that here. So unfortunately, our food system is energy dense, and we invest a lot of energy in producing the food that we're not using. And what I mean by resources primarily is oil. So as you see there, the bottom figure, 4% of all U.S. energy consumption is embedded in food that we currently throw away. So it's just this massive amount of oil, and that's because oil is used at every part of the food chain. It's used to plant, to fertilize, to harvest, to ship, cook, cool, and then when we're done with that food and we don't use it, to ship the food off to the landfill. So it's a very energy dense process. Unfortunately, when I'm trying to persuade you folks that this is a huge issue, 4% doesn't really sound like much, right? It's almost like a rounding error, even though it's a massive amount of oil. So here's another way of looking at it. Well, this is the Deepwater Horizon spill from a few years back. And that was certainly an ecological disaster, but every year we're wasting 70 times that amount of oil through the food that we don't eat. So 70 times. But at least we got a cool movie out of it, right? All right. The other resource that we are wasting at an alarming rate is water, and I don't have to tell Californians about how much water goes into producing food, so I won't lecture you on this, but suffice it to say, a massive amount of that water, as you see there, 40 trillion liters is embedded in the food that isn't used. And just to give you a bit of perspective on what that looks like, it's roughly the size of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And finally, the last environmental factor at play here is methane. And the basic equation here is pretty rudimentary, but when we dig a big hole and throw food in there, it leads to that food decomposing without air, and that leads to methane creation. And methane is a greenhouse gas that is more than 20 times as potent as CO2 at trapping heat. This is a passive methane vent at a landfill that's been closed, but the methane from the food decomposing will continue to seep out into the environment for years to come. And as you see there, landfills are the number 2 source of methane emissions in the country after, any guesses? Cows. Yes, good. And so here's a case where we're basically aiding climate change from our kitchen waste bins. And we really should try to cut down on the amount of food that ends up in a landfill. Okay, so transitioning a little bit here. So those are some of the key implications, and here's the bridge to convey the impact of wasted food with the opportunity here on how we can actually do some good by reducing the amount of wasted food. So there's a Project Drawdown, which is a book and an initiative led by Paul Hawken. It's basically ranking solutions on what we can do to minimize the impact of climate change and to hopefully prevent it. And they found that reducing food waste by 50% would be the number 3 most impactful solution. And so to me, that is encouraging because, as I mentioned before, I think this is a pretty solvable problem. And cutting it in half is very doable. And that's why the U.S. government, through the FDA, EPA, and USDA, have set that goal of 50% reduction by 2030. The UN has done the same, and that's kind of seen as an achievable goal. So hopefully we can meet that. But how do we do that? I mean, that's the key question here. Where do we go? And what are the solutions we can turn to? So fortunately, there's a lot we can do. And I think it's really important to prioritize the reduction of wasted food as opposed to redistributing and recycling. And they're all part of this solution, but we focus too much, in my opinion, on what's easiest to do, and that's recycling of excess food. And in that case, it's usually composting. But following that hierarchy, the reduce, reuse, recycle mantra, and there's a reason reduce is first, right? And that's because it's the most important. So the EPA has transferred that mantra into this food recovery hierarchy, which to me gives us a good roadmap on where to emphasize our actions. So fortunately, the first one there, source reduction, that just means trying to reduce the amount of excess food we create. And we'll get into a lot of the specifics on how you actually do that, but that's something where we will play a role. If we can't do that, then let's try to take that excess food and feed hungry people. So do some of the great work that Bill and other nonprofits are doing with redistributing food. If we can't do that, feeding livestock or animals with excess food is the next best choice. If you can't do that, industrial uses is this nebulous term for creating energy from excess food. If we can't do that, then composting what's left to recycle the nutrients. And then only if we can't do any of the above should we be landfilling or incinerating. Now, unfortunately, in real life, this hierarchy has been flipped on its head. And every day we're throwing away about 95% of the excess food. So we have a lot of room for improvement, which is kind of fun because we're going to talk about how we do that. So how can you all play a role in that solution? Well, when we look at where the food waste is coming from, we talked about the various steps of the food chain, but what I didn't mention is that the most food waste, when it comes to tons, is coming from households. So it's coming from us. And so, to me, there's good and bad news there. The bad news is that we are pretty darn wasteful. The good news is that we can have a major impact, and we have real agency here. And I do believe that there's no greater environmental problem where we can have as large of an impact with as little effort. So what does that effort look like? Well, first of all, we talked about how we don't use about a quarter of the food we bring home. So let's get smarter at how we shop. So how does that work? Well, you could make a detailed shopping list and really stick to that list after you've meal planned. Or you could go to the store more often, make more trips and buy less each time. So be a little more nimble about how much food you're bringing into your home. Whatever solution works best for you is the one that's going to be sustainable. Just a word to the wise, if you're going to have that big weekly shopping trip and have that shopping list, just be careful who gets the pen and who gets to write on that list and what ends up on that list. I think that snakes item was meant to be snacks. We've been working on spelling in our house. Anyhow, it's kind of vague too, snacks. Leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Anyway, the next step we can take is to expand the label of what's acceptable in our stores. And we've talked a little bit about how retailers are creating that perfection expectation in the store, and they'll say that they're acting on the demand of the shopper. And that's why they are so exacting on food's appearance. And so here's an opportunity for us to communicate that we don't mind a carrot that's a little curved or a banana that is too straight for the retail market, and communicate that taste should trump appearance. And so there's some stores that will sell these goods marked in some sort of campaign where it's quirky or ugly produce. There's actually a company called Imperfect Produce that will deliver a box of odd-shaped or imperfect produce to your door, and do so at a slight discount from what you'd pay in the store. So that's encouraging. We're making some progress, but we need you to help along those lines. And finally, on the retail front, just keeping this in mind, I know that there are a lot of messages in tonight's talk, but I hope that when you're in the store, when you're in that retail setting, you think about the problem and the impact that we can all have. And I do believe in the contagiousness of action. If you're taking this message to heart and start to change some of your behavior, people in your life will notice, and it'll catch on. So yeah, think about the impact that you can have. If it's helpful, you can think about me, and I can be that guy nagging you to not buy too much if that's helpful. When you are out at a restaurant or when you're serving friends or family, let's think about portion size. That might be a little bit of an extreme on the other end of the spectrum, but basically just trying to avoid that scenario where we're either overeating or wasting food. And I think we'll all be quite adept at recognizing that happy medium and make it comfortable for people to take seconds. Serve a little bit and let people take more if they want it. Because as we know, once the food ends up on your plate, it's not usable anymore. But when we are put in that position at a restaurant, perhaps, of being, let's call it, overserved, then we need to turn to Doggie Bags as a solution, and let's make those even more of the norm. Although not that kind of doggy bag, and not that kind of doggy bag either, but rather this kind of taking your leftovers home and actually using them. And here's the thing, it doesn't do any good to bring your food home and then throw it away 3 or 4 days later. So you have to actually use it. And if you're not going to use it, you can put it in your freezer and expand the lifespan of that food. And a lot of people ask if it's worth the expenditure of wrapping and paper to take that food home. And I always tell people that it is. They've studied the impact, and it's about a 10-to-1 impact, the food waste versus the packaging waste. And so if you are in that position where you're not sure if you want to waste the box or the plastic bag, then I would say go for it. Of course, you can also carry around a metal container, but that is some high-level food waste avoiding. So if you want to go for it, that's cool, but maybe next week. All right, and so on the hierarchy, we talked a little bit about recovering food and redistributing that excess, and here's a great way for you to volunteer and to be part of that hands-on solution. There are a number of organizations in town and in the county that are doing great work. So in addition to Bracken's Kitchen, you've got Waste Not OC. Food Finders are doing great work too. And Second Harvest, I didn't get a chance to throw them in there, but I'll throw them a plug. And basically, there's a large opportunity to help out if you're so inclined. And the one theme that I would push here is to really focus on the healthiest food possible, because I mentioned that nutrient hunger, and too often the food banks and food recovery groups are getting the less healthy food items because they're the least perishable, and they're the ones that the stores most want to donate. Here's a good point for me to say. There's a federal shield law that protects donors from liability. It's called the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act, and it's been around since the 90s. And so if people are wondering if they're putting themselves at risk by donating food, they aren't. And this is mostly restaurants and stores, not individuals. But for businesses who are donating food to a nonprofit, they're protected from liability there. And I'm always surprised by how powerful a notion that is. Like, I hear this a lot. I would love to give food, but I don't want to get sued. And number one, that's inaccurate. Number two, there's never been a lawsuit where someone's actually turned around and bitten the hand that's feeding them, figuratively, or literally, as far as I know. But anyhow, so the point being, if you want to donate food, if a store does or a restaurant, there's a way to do it. It's just a matter of figuring out the logistics, and that's where those great nonprofits come in. Okay, and the last few things that I think are so important is that we need to focus on teaching kids to not waste food. Unfortunately, in our school settings, we're doing the opposite, and we're teaching kids that food is trash. And that's because we're forcing them to take certain items. There isn't as much choice as there could be, and we're not giving them a way to redistribute or to share that food. So it's like, you have to take this food. If you don't want it, just throw it out. The trash can's over there. And to me, that is shocking, and it is the thing we really need to address, because number one, obviously kids are the future, and they're going to be tomorrow's shoppers. And so if we're teaching them that food is trash and it's just another thing in our throwaway society that they can toss into the garbage without a care, then that's going to have an impact in 10, 15, 20 years as they become the main shoppers in this country. But secondly, kids are great ambassadors and persuaders. So if we teach them in school that food is something to value and to treat carefully and to cherish and not something to waste, they're going to bring that message home, and you're going to hear about it. And if you do, I'm sorry, but I apologize in advance if your kids or grandkids start nagging you about not throwing away that leftovers from 2 days ago, or why aren't you taking leftovers home from the restaurant. But I think when we start hearing that, we'll know that we've made a real impact and are on the path to being a healthier culture. And so here's a simple way of doing it. A lot of schools in California, but elsewhere, have created this concept called a share table. It's not really high tech. It's basically like putting a table in front of the trash can, and instead of telling kids to throw away their food they don't want, tell them to put it on the share table, and their fellow students can take items that they see that they want, or at the end of the meal period, it can be taken off and redistributed to hungry people. It could also be reserved in that school. The USDA has said that's okay as well. So just providing that simple mechanism, a table like you see there, that would do the trick. And creating that culture of repurposing will go a long way toward helping create a healthier school food culture. All right, and then finally, on a more holistic sense, we really need to connect with our food wherever you are in the system, whether that means growing your own food or buying from a farmer or the producer, or even something as simple as cooking more often. A lot of times people will say to me, they don't have time to cook. Who has time to cook these days? And I find when we set our mind to it, we'll find the time. And it's not that difficult. I mean, kids can do it. Cats can do it these days. I have the utmost confidence that everyone in this room can cook dinner. And so hopefully we will do that and connect with our food, because frankly, when we are closer to our food, we value it more, we respect it more, we know what goes into creating it, and that makes it so much harder to waste it. And the very idea of wasting it seems so strange, given that we have that personal investment in it. So hopefully we can all get closer to our food. So I'll leave you with a couple of numbers here. In 2050, the expectation is that there will be 9.5 billion of us on this planet. That's a lot of zeros there and a lot of mouths to feed. So when people hear those numbers, a lot of thinkers in the agricultural world and the food circles jump to the conclusion that we're going to have to create more farmland, cut down more forests to create arable lands to produce more food. Or we're going to have to turn to GMO crops on a more widespread basis. And those may or may not be true. Those are other conversations for other evenings. But my point here is that before we turn to those drastic moves, we need to focus on being as efficient with our food supply as we can. And I believe efficiency is going to be a real buzzword in food circles in the next 5 and 10 years, especially as we're coming to grips with this population growth. And so let's keep that in mind, but also just think about how we can feed this planet. We have more than enough food to feed everyone on this planet, in this country, in this state, in this community. It's just going to take a little bit of effort and finding the social and political will to harness that excess food and to do so much good with it and nourish the folks who don't have the right amounts of food. And so hopefully we can all be part of that solution, and I have faith that we will find a way. So with that, I thank you for your time. You've been a wonderful audience, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. Thanks. Okay, thanks so much. Yes, sir, we have a question over there.
It's not a question, it's, I want to interview.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Hear, hear. Yes, sir.
Well, recognizing that we produce more food and there's so much investment in agricultural properties, equipment, the whole process, and we have a problem that you've described so well. Are there, if you look at other countries and other societies and economies that are more like us, maybe Western Europe probably, is anybody closer to doing it better or right that we can, take some lessons from than what we're doing, recognizing they're probably spending a lot more for their food than we are here on a daily basis?
Yeah, that's a great point. So when you look at comparisons with other countries, pointing to Western Europe, there are a couple of exemplars. Denmark has been a real leader in this area, as has Great Britain. And what's happened is that the governments there have latched onto the topic and realized it's a waste of money and it's bad for the environment. And so they've formed different organizations, funded research on the topic, and then figured out a way to put some of that research money and public dollars into action. And to me, that's the place we need to look. We had the administration recently in this country just announced a goal to reduce wasted food by 50% by 2030, but there was no plan, and there is no plan. There's no resources to go with that as well. So, I think there's an opportunity there, and I just think we need more specifics and more emphasis. And in many countries in Western Europe, there has been resources and research to the topic, and as well as a few different countries passing laws, so policy solutions, France and Italy in particular, where they're sort of mandated to donate excess food, and that certainly helps. So whether it's the carrot or the stick, so to speak, whether it's just tax incentives for donating or being compelled to donate, my sense is in the U.S. we wouldn't be able to pass that kind of law that forces donation, but let's reward the people who do. And I think there's a real opportunity for that. Thanks. Okay, yes, ma'am, in the middle there. Yeah, so the comment was about the Korean way of dealing with waste and basically making people pay for the volume or the weight of what they throw out. And that concept, the pay as you throw, so to speak, it's really quite effective, and it makes us think about how much waste we're creating. And we are all economically motivated beings and creatures, so it's a good motivator. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so the question is about farm subsidies and how does that play into this equation? Well, so I talked about the cost of food, and what I didn't say is that it's an artificial cheapness to a certain extent because we're subsidizing so much of our commodity crops. And so food perhaps is too inexpensive. We don't really pay the full cost of it, as with gasoline. And so that definitely plays a role in this picture. But the flip side of that equation is, should we say that food should be more expensive? And that's quite an elitist argument to make, especially when so many people struggle to find enough to eat. So it's a nuanced conversation that needs to happen, but I think we need to think about how we subsidize food and what kinds of foods get subsidized, and maybe think about requiring people who receive federal subsidies to harvest and redistribute all that they grow, as opposed to just plowing under certain fields. Because a lot of times there's excess planted just in case something goes wrong. And when things work out and the weather cooperates, then a lot of times you'll have entire fields not harvested. And that's not a great use of resources. Yes, sir. Okay, so there's a model there. So someone's harnessing the excess at the 99-cent store. And you have to get there early. You heard it first here. And basically it's produce or other foods that doesn't look quite right. Okay. Yeah, there are definitely some solutions in place, and it's good to see.
It was created here, and the Canadians saw what a good thing it was, and they bought the whole organization.
Okay, well, that's great. I'm glad to see that solution's out there. Yeah, and certainly other cities and towns have that kind of niche for goods that are perfectly edible but just not sellable, and that's the problem there. Yeah. Yes, ma'am, in the middle. Oh, yeah, that's a great point. So a kind of campaign like the Be Wise with Water campaign to get people to think about that. Okay, well, actually, I have one more slide. I threw it in there because I like to give a plug. So there's this campaign called Save the Food. And it's really clever and well done. It's created by the Ad Council along with NRDC, and those are the people who made Smokey the Bear and Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk. And so this campaign exists, but it's not national. It's a slow rollout, and you might see it in more communities as time goes on, but I think we really need to make it a national thing. And as you can see, it's well done and gets the point across and raises awareness, which is what we really need to do. So, great point. Yes, sir. Yeah, okay, so the question was, have I talked to grocers about putting in place some strategies to sell foods that, at a discount at the end of the day, or that are soon to reach their sell-by date or whatever. And so, yeah, there's some stores that do that. They have tactics in place to try to sell their goods at a discount, and I applaud those who do. But a lot of stores shy away from that tactic because they don't want that image. They don't want to create any image that their store has anything that isn't at the peak of freshness. And unfortunately, that mindset prevents a lot of strategies that could be used to reduce the amount of excess. I mean, they could sell half loaves of bread as well for people who live alone or aren't going to use all of that. But, there's a lot that could be done that isn't. And some of it has to do with, frankly, profit margins. Why sell something at half price when they could sell it at full price? And knowing that they don't pay tons for that food, they'd probably rather just take the loss and sell the item at full price. So there's a motivational problem there. There's a little bit of an economic problem, but and then there's also that mindset or psychology. And just kind of a sidebar to that comment, I talked to a lot of produce managers when I was researching the book about what they have in their sections and how closely they cull the fruits and vegetables. And stores know that the shopper's perception of the fruits and vegetables in the store largely affects whether they return to that store. So they'd rather throw out a lot of fruit and vegetable and have you return as the shopper for months and years to come. And that's part of the driving factor of why they cull the displays so closely. Yes, sir. Yeah, so the question is what's fast food doing in this situation, and have I seen anything there? So I actually worked at the first establishment you mentioned that starts with an M. So they didn't have as much waste as you might expect. Where I saw the most waste was in the French fries and the hash browns, which had a rule that if they sat for 7 minutes, they were trash. And a lot of the customers actually knew of that policy at this particular establishment and would request the fresh ones and return ones that weren't piping hot. So that was a little disheartening. But by and large, fast food restaurants are pretty well-oiled machines and don't have as much waste. And no pun intended there. But it's really a question of harnessing that module. I mean, a lot of people eat fast food because it's cheap and convenient. And so if we could find a way to just kind of make it a little healthier, I think we'll be in a better place. But in terms of waste, I didn't see a lot of plate waste either at those restaurants, and that's probably a factor of economics. But yeah. Yes, ma'am. Good question. How do we learn to preserve our food? Well, I mean, I think the first choice is to find grandma or grandpa and have a heart-to-heart with them about what that was like. How we used to do things in the old days. But this being a library, I should say there's so many good books on how to can, how to preserve. And, I don't have any favorites. I couldn't single out any over others, but it's kind of catching on again. And there's a lot of good resources out there, how to pickle things. Yes, ma'am. Are you going to tell me which book to recommend? Or what are you going to tell me a call number?
There's a great resource, the Master Gardeners. They have also Master Food Preservers.
Okay. The Master Gardener Program, yes, or the Master Preservers. Yeah, that's a national program, and it teaches us to connect with our food better. And yeah, please. Okay, that's great. So a heartfelt endorsement for Imperfect Produce. Thank you. That's great. All right, well, I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions you have. But who hasn't had a chance to ask a question?
One last question.
Okay, yes, ma'am. Okay, question, organic food versus conventional. Yeah, is there a big difference? It's kind of leveled off. I think at the beginning of organic going national and becoming more of an established thing, you had people were more accepting of organic for its blemishes or imperfections. And also, I think the people who would buy organic perhaps were folks who grew their own food to a certain extent and knew that not every food item grew in this perfect homogeneous way, and so they were more forgiving. I think it's evened out a little bit, and now consumers, whether they're buying organic or conventional, want it to look just right. So it's unfortunately about the same. But I'd like to see us return to being a bit more forgiving and expanding that range of what's acceptable. And growing your own food is a great way to do that, because you see that food grows in funky and odd ways, and I try and celebrate that and push that the taste is really what matters, and the nutrition, not what it looks like. All right, well, thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
I'm happy to answer any questions in the courtyard.
Jonathan will be signing books right up here at the front table. And then we can all join Bill Bracken out in the courtyard for his food.